Hey, Zach Foster here. You know, this was originally going to be another one of those documentary style videos with the pre-recorded audio and all the beautiful moving images and whatnot, but unfortunately the audio file, along with many hours of production work, were corrupted and lost. There is no getting it back, and I couldn't just not do a video about today. So for today, you're going to have to just put up with my face. But thank you for watching Venezuela Explained. So, the November 21st regional elections, the November 21st so-called regional elections in Venezuela. Is the opposition going to get anything out of this? No. Certain people who call themselves opposition will get something out of this for themselves, but as far as will these elections put Venezuela on a stable footing towards democracy? Will they do anything to weaken the usurper regime? No, absolutely not. Why? Well, for starters, just in case YouTube wants to flag me or any of the people from the interim government want to flag me with the stupid YouTube guidelines, I am not telling people don't go out to vote if you happen to be a Venezuelan, although there are plenty of Venezuelans saying that. The latest mega-analysis poll numbers from Venezuela show that more than 70% of the country completely rejects those elections. But why is this not going to do anything for the so-called opposition? For starters, the interim government, which was the backbone of the opposition, the legal channel through which 60 countries in the free world could recognize a new transitional Venezuelan government and not the Maduro usurper regime, which is really a Cuban colony, that interim government doesn't exist anymore. It signed away its sovereignty when Juan Guaido, the interim president, and all his minions working under him in the interim government gave their blessing to the dialogue. It was really a monologue between factions of the regime, but the dialogue in Mexico City between the main faction of the regime, the Chavista Maduristas, the United Socialist Party, the delegation headed by Jorge Rodriguez. And on the other side was the so-called opposition, but every single one of those people in the opposition, so-called opposition, is willing to cohabitate with the usurper regime, which has already killed more than 400,000 people in 22 years in power. And those numbers are absolutely historic for Venezuela. It's a joke. But Gerardo Blythe signed away the sovereignty of the interim government because one of the conditions in order for that Maduro set out in order to sit down with the so-called opposition in Mexico City was that the opposition, that being the interim government, and all the opposition parties, all had to recognize Maduro's usurper government as the quote-unquote legitimate government of Venezuela. So Guaido not only gave his blessing to Gerardo Blythe to sign not on behalf of the interim government, but on behalf of the entire unitary platform of Venezuela, that being all the opposition. And because Juan Guaido sent members of his National Assembly and his ex-ambassadors, including Guanipa, at least nominated them or sent them to go negotiate on behalf of the so-called opposition, it rendered them null and void. Between that signature on behalf of the entire unitary platform of Venezuela and also Article 138 of the Venezuelan Constitution, which says that any usurped authority is completely null and void, so are all its acts, and anybody who works with the usurper authority is also canceled. So between that signature, signing away the sovereignty of the interim government, and Article 138 of the Constitution, the interim government does not exist. So they actually regressed. They regressed to 2016, 2017, 2018 levels, where it's just the opposition parties fighting against a regime that gets more and more powerful. Except since 2017, the Venezuelan government is like fully communized and it has become a fully totalitarian government. But let's do a thought experiment here. Let's play devil's advocate. Let's go into the possibility of what if the opposition actually gets a good turnout in these regional elections? Surely that's got to do something. All right, let's move past and just forget that the opposition, the so-called opposition, has done everything possible to fumble the football in the struggle for Venezuela's freedom for more than a decade. Starting with, they were the ones that actually introduced the gun control bill into the Venezuelan National Assembly. That was not Hugo Chavez's party. They obviously wanted that bill because Hugo Chavez wanted to disarm the population, so that his supporters would be in control, his soldiers and his paramilitary supporters. But it was opposition parties that introduced that crap for Chavez. They thought that if they played along, they could get along. And these are people in the United Socialist Party. These people do not have any intention to get along. Let's just forget that people from Voluntad Popular, that being Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez's party, actually tried to get Alex Saab off the hook with the U.S. for money laundering. This is, if you guys want more details, Google search Freddie Superlano letter on behalf of Alex Saab. This was in 2019, and yeah, they tried to get this Maduro money launderer off the hook with the U.S., and it didn't work. Let's just forget that the opposition long ago took military intervention and even armed insurgency for national liberation off the table. These are words, textual words from Juan Guaido. La insurgencia armada no es una opción. Armed insurgency is not an option. Let's just forget that in January of 2019, the so-called opposition parties, the big four leading opposition parties, rejected the Brazilian government's offer to host a transitional Venezuelan government in Venezuelan terrain and safe territory. But they didn't want that. They had already decided, before Juan Guaido was even a puppet of the leaders of the four big opposition parties, they had already decided that they were going to go straight to elections with the regime and just cohabitate with this historically criminal, kleptocratic, violent, murderous regime, which has literally become a drug cartel. It's not like in Mexico where drug cartels run the country, but they tolerate the Mexican government because international blah, blah, blah. No, the actual government, Maduro's government, has become in and of itself a drug cartel. The CIA co-opted drug cartels in Latin America in the 1980s. The Maduro government has become a drug cartel, and it's silly to think that those guys are going to respect election results. Let's focus on the principal reason why today's November 21st regional elections are a joke. You want to know the main reason, the number one reason? All right, this is it. Venezuela is militarily invaded. Venezuela is militarily invaded. There are 40,000 Cuban regular troops in Venezuela at any time. Most of them are dressed either in Venezuelan uniforms, the majority, or they're dressed in civilian clothes, and they're planted along different areas of the country and different strata of society. Cuban soldiers are trained in different Venezuelan dialects for several months at different bases in Pinar del Rio province, among others, before they're deployed to Venezuela. All these different methods are how you disguise an invasion. There is a secret Cuban military government in Venezuela that is running Venezuela. It's called the Cuban Cooperation and Liaison Group, and the Spanish acronym is GRUCE. It's informally known as El Gruce, and it has existed at least since 2012 that we are aware of, according to actual debates and discussions that are documented for public record in Venezuela's National Assembly back in the year 2012. These military officers in the GRUCE, that being the secret military government for Venezuela, those guys always wear civilian clothes. I've seen lots of photographs, and you'll see one guy in civilian clothes flanked by 10 Venezuelan generals. And you know that guy in civilian clothes is a Cuban general, and he's one of the guys who's actually running the show, and the Venezuelans are just taking orders from their colonial masters. So these guys in the GRUCE who wear civilian clothes, they run both the Venezuelan armed forces and the civilian side of the Venezuelan government. The GRUCE really is a shadow government, and it really is Cuba's colonial administration in Venezuela. Then there are an additional 30,000 Cuban militiamen and militiawomen in Venezuela at any given time. These guys are known as the CDR, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. But first, I forgot to talk about the Cuban Doctors. Most Cuban doctors are already reserve military officers in Cuba's armed forces. This is due to Cuba's mandatory service laws. And by the time these guys graduate medical school, they will have already completed basic military training and gotten their reserve officer's commission in the FAR. Anybody in the medical missions who's not in the FAR is most likely a member of the CDR or the Rapid Response Brigades, the BRR. Sorry, guys, translating Spanish acronyms to English in my head. So the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, and that would be anybody who's not specifically a doctor who's already commissioned. So other medical workers, nurses, nurse practitioners, people who just are janitors at the Cuban medical missions, Cuban teachers, economists who are working with different Venezuelan government ministries, social workers planted in different parts, different neighborhoods, and different areas of civil society. All of these different aid workers that Venezuela loves to talk about, how awesome they are, but that these countries are paying for. And that's right, the Cuban doctors and teachers are not free. The recipient country always pays top dollar for them. That includes that includes the Maduro government, which is Cuba's colonial regime. And in that sense, it is very similar to old world imperialism of the 18th and 19th centuries, in which all this economic activity would be happening in these conquered colonies, and people would just be sending money and resources directly to the conquering country or the quote-unquote mother country at way the hell below market prices. And obviously the whole system is set up specifically to benefit the colonizing force. In this case, Cuba is the colonizing force. But the majority of the people, if not all of them, involved in these medical missions and these other humanitarian missions are in the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution are Cuban government-controlled civilian organizations, and the CDRs are really hybrids. They are, on one hand, civilian political fronts where they will take the idiots from the American Socialist delegations to go help out for a day at a cooperative farm while some of the old farts tell nice stories about Che Guevara. That's one manifestation of the CDR. But the other manifestation of the CDR, it is a paramilitary element where the CDRs are a backup militia for the Castro regime, along with the Cuban National Militia and the Communist Party's Rapid Response Brigades. Whenever a protest in Cuba gets too hot for the local police to handle or too fast, then they call in the CDR. And when they call in the CDRs, all these military-aged males from their late teens to mid-40s, physically fit males, will show up with armbands and wooden clubs or metal clubs and riot shields, and they show up ready to bust heads to defend Fidel Castro's regime. Many of these doctors and teachers in these Cuban humanitarian missions are also not real credentialed professionals of those fields. They're actually soldiers and or spies from state security or military intelligence or Cuban military counterintelligence who are simply occupying a slot on a supposed civilian humanitarian mission. Then there are even the ones who really are licensed and trained professionals, real licensed and trained doctors. They're still often forced into the CDR, which means they are doing the job that they're sent to that country to do, but their job also has extra layers. One of them is political, and the other one is absolutely paramilitary. So doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, if they're not actively doing militia training while they are in the country that Cuba conquered, in this case Venezuela, then they will be out doing other important work to keep Maduro's party, the United Socialist Party, in power. So they'll be gathering intelligence on all their patients in case they got to use it, or in case there's anything useful that they could turn over to the police or to military counterintelligence. They especially love getting intelligence on opposition people, even from the Chavista minor opposition parties. So the little democratic Chavista parties, the PSUV will even spy on them and repress them. These Cuban doctors and other Cuban professionals will be proselytizing for Maduro's party, telling people that, oh, isn't it so great that you're getting this service today? It's this revolutionaries party's It's these guys are the reason why you guys are getting this benefit. So I hope you guys remember that. Which, it's a really odd thing for your doctor to be telling you. They oftentimes, and they've been doing this for at least 8 years that we're aware of, these guys low-key threaten people, the people that they're supposedly sent to help, that the government subsidized food benefits that they get every month will be cut, or they won't get the critical medication that they need for their heart or their diabetes, or single moms will lose their free childcare for the day that allows them to go work their day job. Or if grandma needs a kidney transplant, oh, sorry. Ooh, looks like grandma's surgery appointment got totally deleted from the system. That kind of thing happens all the time, and it is these Cuban doctors doing it. I actually spoke to a deserter from one of the Cuban medical missions. This gentleman spoke to the New York Times. His name is Dr. Carlos Ramirez, and he is one of the few Cuban doctors who just had the conscience to say, you know what? If I can't practice medicine in this country, I might as well just go live my life and not be actively hurting or repressing people. Anyway, so on top of 40,000 Cuban regulars in Venezuela at any given time, you got 30,000 CDR personnel, which are essential to Cuba's control of the civilian side of Maduro's government, while the Cuban armed forces control the Venezuelan military and the pro-Chavista paramilitary forces, like the Revolutionary Collectives, the Tupamaros, Alexis Lives, the Carapaica Collective. There are so many paramilitary groups out there that were armed by this regime. So, oh yeah, Maduro's armed forces have around 120,000 regulars. So compared to 120,000 regulars, there's 70,000 Cuban soldiers and militia in the country, and these guys are the ones who are actually running the show. So 70,000 compared to 120,000, that's actually a pretty hefty counterweight to Venezuelan personnel. I'm not even going to talk about the 2 million people supposedly in the Bolivarian National Militia because, oh, that force is such a joke. It's sad, really. They've had a number of people die in the National Militia from like training accidents or just being on parade because malnutrition, or they have a lot of 70-year-olds in that organization. So people just had a stroke, in formation, and boom, they drop. It's sad. But 70,000 Cubans compared to 120,000 Venezuelan regulars, it becomes a lot easier to understand why it's been so difficult for Venezuelan soldiers to do military rebellions against the Maduro regime, aka Cuba's colonial administration in Venezuela. And then, of course, we cannot forget all of the Colombian Marxist guerrilla armies, principally the FARC dissidents and the ELN, that being Colombia's so-called National Liberation Army, and then there are other smaller guerrilla groups. I'm not denying that there are Colombian paramilitary groups, which a lot of left-wingers like to call right-wing, even though most Colombian paramilitaries are just not communist. But I guess just not being communist makes you a right-wing fascist to people who are communists. You can see how those folks convolute the terms, but that's why we just shouldn't let pro-Castro and pro-Maduro communists shape all the discourse and shape all the language that we use. Anyway, there are quote-unquote right-wing paramilitaries in Venezuela often, but they're a lot more transient. They have to retreat back into safe territory a lot. Really, the ones who have conquered territory are the FARC dissidents and the ELN. Chavez originally gave them safe haven back in the 2000s. Part of it is because he wanted the Colombian Civil War to be extended. He wanted the Marxist guerrillas to have a safe operating base in Venezuela. And he wanted Colombia to end up being a Marxist state, the way Chavez himself fully intended that Venezuela should end up as a Marxist state. So Chavez is the one who brought that cancer into Venezuela in the first place, gave them safe haven, extended the Colombian Civil War, but it also came back to bite the United Socialist Party in the ass, because now without Chavez around, the guerrillas just do what they want. And recently, there is a civil war within the FARC dissidents between the Second Marquetalia, which is Jesus Santrich's group, and then I believe, Ivan Marquez's 10th front. Um, I don't know. It's not Ivan Marquez. It was somebody else. Um, Gentil Duarte. That's right. Gentil Duarte's 10th front. The Venezuelan regime, Cuba's colonial administration in Venezuela, bet incorrectly on Jesus Santrich. They were giving Santrich protection inside of Caracas while his guerrillas were running wild in many states of the country. They bet wrong because Gentil Duarte's guerrilleros won that civil war within the FARC dissidents, and that particular faction controls huge swaths of land just in the state of Apure, although the Colombian guerrillas are present in at least half the states of Venezuela, if not all the states of Venezuela, and they made it all the way to the Essequibo territory, the disputed territory between Venezuela and Guyana. The ELN made it all the way over there, and that's because Hugo Chavez let these people in the country. So you've got Cuban soldiers, 70,000 of them. You've got anywhere between 6 to 10,000 Colombian guerrillas, and even that term is starting to get convoluted because the organizations are Colombian, the founders of the organizations are Colombian, but in the last 3 years especially, as the economic crisis in Venezuela spirals, a lot of people being recruited into the Colombian guerrillas are poor, young, destitute Venezuelans. A lot of the young people get recruited by force. I actually helped somebody get out of ICE detention over here who was a refugee because in his home state of Zulia, the ELN wanted to recruit him, and they do not take no for an answer, and they were getting real tired of him making excuses for why he'll come next week, so yeah, it's an ugly thing, and for the folks who are not forcibly drafted into it, a lot of them do it because they just have no other means. They have no other means to feed themselves, to feed their families, so they make a deal with the devil. A lot of people make a deal with the devil to try and keep themselves alive. Then on top of all those a-holes, you have Russian troops, anywhere from a few hundred to at least 1,000 Russian regulars. They are doing all kinds of things like installing radars, flying drones. I have seen photos of Russian drone operators arriving in uniform at Maiquetía Airport. Then there is at least 1,000 military contractors from the Russian company Rosneft, although I don't doubt that there's a couple thousand extra mercenaries because that has been the Kremlin's game. They pretty much took the old KGB playbook and they took the best of the CIA playbook from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They kind of combined the two and have just been running wild with it. I would remind folks not to get CIA tunnel vision. Yes, CIA and the State Department have done a lot of shady crap around the world, but so has the Soviet Union and the Russians. Finally, and the most important reason why the elections, these regional elections, cannot save Venezuela is the regime already hijacked all the opposition parties. What does that mean, the regime hijacked the opposition parties? All right, if you are, for example, an American Democrat, imagine that the next DNC meeting, a bunch of Democrats walk in the room, and then you see Steve Bannon and Eric Trump and Ronna McDaniel and 3,000-year-old Mitch McConnell sitting around a table going, yes, we are the new Democratic National Committee, appointed by order of the Supreme Court. Or if that doesn't quite work for you, imagine you're walking into a Republican National Committee meeting and you see Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Beto O'Rourke and AOC sitting around a table going, hi, we're the new RNC. Yeah, we're the GOP now. Obviously, you would be suspecting some shenanigans. And that is exactly what the regime did with the opposition parties, including Guaido and Lopez's party, Voluntad Popular, but the regime did it to all of them. So Venezuela is militarily invaded. It is a colony for Cuba. Venezuela has been sending Cuba below market prices gas and oil for years now in exchange for their doctors, which really are soldiers and militiamen, assisting in the continuing conquest and repression and Cubanization of Venezuela. And then you also have their allies among the Russian army, thousands of Colombian guerrillas, and then other drug trafficking and terrorist organizations. I also forgot to mention Hezbollah basically runs the island of Margarita. They have a number of paramilitary training camps there, and they also have a number of fake businesses, not just in Margarita, but across Venezuela that they use for laundering money for their jihads, their various jihads in the Middle East. So you've got 70,000 Cuban regulars and militia. You've got another 6 to 10,000 Colombian Marxist guerrillas. You've got anywhere between a couple hundred to a couple thousand Russian experts installing radars and surface-to-air missiles, basically making it impossible to invade Venezuela from the outside. And also, the regime literally controls all the opposition parties. So anybody who is participating in the regime's elections as a candidate, an opposition candidate, they have already had their secret private meetings with people from the regime for what is expected of them and what they are going to get out of it and what's going to happen to them and their families if they don't stick to the deal that Darth Vader is generously dictating to them. And he has altered the deal. Pray that he does not alter it further. All of those people have already made their deal. They are already in bed with the regime. So there's Cuban soldiers, Russian soldiers, Colombian Marxist guerrillas, Hezbollah, all these different people as invaders, and not to mention a number of Venezuelan soldiers have already been bought off with privileges by the regime. So a lot of those guys have no problem repressing the people because there's money in it for them. They're cynical. They don't see Venezuela having a bright future. So, hey, screw it. They're going to get theirs. The regime controls all the opposition parties. But principally, yeah, Venezuela is militarily invaded. And you cannot vote invaders out. You could not vote the Germans out of Poland in 1939. You could not vote the Soviet Union out of Hungary or Czechoslovakia in the 1950s. As a matter of fact, literally, they tried to vote out communism, and the result was that the colonizing force sent their army to reestablish communism. Not making any excuses for when the United States or the CIA has done that, but this is not a CIA project. The disaster that you see in Venezuela is a Cuban project, a Cuban experiment, and it was also the dream of this insane person named Hugo Chavez who just had this hero worship complex for Fidel Castro. It really goes down to that, and this guy began acting like a dictator years ago before the rest of the world opened their eyes to the reality that Venezuela is under a one-party dictatorship. And while many well-meaning people are going to be reporting on these so-called regional elections happening today, they're going to have a lot of incorrect information. Many of those well-meaning people might realize that it is a one-party state. Venezuela is a one-party state under a usurper dictatorship, but most of them are totally missing the fact that Venezuela is militarily invaded, and you cannot get rid of that by voting. And Juan Guaido is a collaborator as long as he continues to say that armed insurgency for reasons of national liberation is simply not an option. If Venezuela is to survive as a country and not just be another member republic of the Latin American Soviet Union that Cuba is trying to build, then national liberation operations are their only choice. That's from a military strategic point of view. From international law, that would have to be other countries acting to remove these military invaders from that country. But who's going to send their army to stand up for them? As long as the rest of the world wants to BS themselves that they're in this for peace and they don't want to start a war. Well, they didn't start the war. The Cubans started the war. They already invaded, and then this revolution from the top down that they have inflicted on the people has resulted in more than 400,000 violent deaths in Venezuela. That's 30% more deaths than the entire American war in Afghanistan, including all enemy combatants killed and all civilian casualties. More people have literally died in Cuba's conquest of Venezuela than the entire American war in Afghanistan. You can't vote that out with governor and mayor elections. It's absolutely a joke. Thank you very much for watching this special edition of Venezuela Explained. Instead of just straight up talking for a half hour, I definitely prefer to go back to the documentary style. You guys have a great day. And please share this video with well-meaning people who are sharing incorrect information. I don't want to yell at those people. I would much rather just educate.